Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Frame by Frame podcast, your ultimate podcast for all things UX and UI. Now, this week we have one of our special guest episodes. Before I introduce him, I'll just give a bit of background. Maybe some of you will be able to guess, maybe some of you won't. He's a UX designer and product designer, along with being a UX instructor for quite a well-known boot camp. Some of his skills that he possesses, uh, he's experienced in fields such as prop tech, fintech, ed tech, startups, as well as design agencies. He's got experience with B2B, business to business, B2C, business to customer, as well as SaaS products, SaaS. For those of you who may not be entirely aware of that, it's to do with selling software online. Basically, think of Office 365. He's got experience in leading design teams. He does freelance design work, consultancy, design mentorship, prototyping wireframes, the whole shebang of UX. And he has a background in journalism and creative writing. Well, if you can't guess who it is, I'm about to introduce him. It is none other than Jonathan Haines. Jonathan, thank you for joining us on our humble podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me. And just to clarify, I don't do all of that stuff at one time.
Pulling back
Well,
the curtain.
no, there's only one person I would expect to do all of that at one time, and that's the AI,
Right.
known as Zach Orleski. He's powered by a Cyberdyne Systems Model 101. He
Yeah,
doesn't
I wish
sleep.
I was a cyborg. Then I wouldn't need to sleep.
Well, you're as close to one as out of all of us, anyway. That's for sure, Zach. All right, Jonathan.
I'm just
So,
good at organizing. Like time blocking saved my life.
you mean
That's
sleepwalking?
Both, yeah.
Both, yeah. Sleepwalking, sleep designing, sleep jogging, sleep marathon training, all of it, right?
yeah, it's amazing how far organization goes because it really kind of structures everything once you kind of get everything in place. I could definitely learn some tips from you for sure.
I hated Notion. I still kind of do. It's capable of great things though, and I've been teaching myself because I don't know if you know what the Para dashboard is, or like the Para program for organizing.
I do not.
So it basically breaks things down into areas, projects, tasks, and resources. And so you build a database in Notion with all these areas, and then you basically build your dashboard by building out the templates for those areas. So anytime you create a new task, it uses that template but organizes it in an area you have. So I can have a project A, project B, project C, and personal life, and then anything I throw in my notepad, well, my Notion now goes directly into its allotted area.
That sounds really
And
cool.
if I don't give it a space, it goes right to the dashboard where that's the first thing I see, so that I'm reminded, like, oh yeah, I thought about that, but where does that go? Okay, that goes here. And then you can use clippings, so any articles I see that relate to something I'm working on, if I find them interesting, I can clip them directly to those areas as well.
I'll definitely have to check that out. I do like Notion. I think that I my productivity is kind of a combination of sometimes Notion, sometimes like a Google Sheet document or Google Sheet, not document because that's a separate tool, I guess. And basically kind of like, using cells to kind of tell me, what to do, what's kind of like outstanding, what else is there to do. So any sort of tips to kind of like make my productivity better. And AI related things are always welcomed as well. Is definitely useful on my end.
Absolutely. No, it's wonderful to have AI as a helper sometimes for organization. I
Yeah.
noticed
when
Notion really
when you're not
utilizes
the
it
AI.
well.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, actually, just I wanted just before we get on to the topics that we wanted to bring to the podcast, could you tell us more about your background? I mean, obviously, our listeners have got a bit of an introduction, your professional skills, but could you divulge your background and what got you into UX and product design,
Yeah,
please? If
sure.
you could, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I guess I think that I mean, like many UX and product designers, especially ones that are my age, um I guess I never really set out to be a designer, or I when I graduated school back in the day, there wasn't any course or major or program that was dedicated to designing products or designing software. I guess the closest thing would be sort of like a coding or developer, computer science related thing, but um, I dabbled in coding. It's not really my thing, but at the same time, I do like to be creative. I study journalism, as you mentioned earlier. I like to write. I like to like just elements of creating things. I didn't study any sort of like graphic design or visual design, but I do have an older brother that did. I mean, he still does. Definitely more in the world of like creating graphics, animations, things like that. He you know, at a young age, I was using Adobe Photoshop. Not probably not very well, but I do remember being like 11 years old and knowing what Photoshop is, knowing what different layers are and how that works. And eventually, like kind of that would kind of lead to now where I'm working with tools like Figma, where it's kind of like, okay, it uses a similar sort of concept where everything is
Yeah.
a separate layer on top of one another.
Yeah, that's pretty much largely how what I did with Photoshop when I was learning about 20 odd something years ago was layers. Although the one thing I never really got into was vector shapes. I
Mhm.
just never seemed to use them. I mean, I know how they work. I could use them, but I always just had a different way of doing things. I don't know whether it was I was just focused on being precise or I just found it quicker to do a more manual way, but I never used vectors, but I've always loved Photoshop actually. It's been my main tool. I mean, I've been using it for 20 years. I've used Illustrator in the past, After Effects. But would you say, John, just before we get into the next thing I wanted to ask, since you brought that up, would you say that, like with Figma, Sketch, and Adobe XD, where if you can use one, you can pretty much use them all? The learning system is very easy. But would you say that if you've used something such as Photoshop, Illustrator, CorelDRAW, Fireworks, Dreamweaver, these are the programs I used to use, and PaintShop Pro, would you say that any future design program can be picked up quite easily and quickly by someone who is so used to a diverse range of design programs?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. I guess like nothing is. I mean, nothing that is built now is built in a vacuum, right? Like all of the ideas that
Yeah,
we have
yeah,
about
nothing is
things
now.
are.
No.
Yeah, so like even what I'm saying about, Figma or Sketch or, XD, those all kind of came from this thing that existed 20 years ago and still exists, Photoshop. But like, the ideas that we have are basically just sort of like remixes of the original ideas. So I would
Yes,
say that like I
yes.
don't I guess I probably learned Sketch first. I don't know how extensively, but um when I started picking up XD or Figma, for example, there were differences, but there's also just kind of like this. Okay, this is kind of like the theme of how to use these things. This is like there is a specific format or like formula for the left side of your screen is going to have this stuff, and the right side of your screen is going to have this stuff, and maybe it'll
Yeah,
be mixed and matched, but I mean, just like anything, it's kind of like the myself being American, I learned one language as a child, but basically, if you are know multiple languages, it's a lot easier to pick up another language. So I think it's kind of a similar sort of thing with that, where the more kind of diverse you are with the tooling that you learn. Like for example,
yes,
I
yeah.
know Webflow, but I'm like picking up Framer, or even other web tools and things like that, like it becomes a little bit easier because I know something like a Webflow or something like that. So
You're cutting the learning curve down at least in half if you're familiar with the basic design programs that we all know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
For
I
sure.
think
yeah,
the biggest thing for a lot of people with Figma, I would say, is like the prototyping, because it is a little complex. It's a new functionality you have in a design app. Like most graphic designers, at least in my perspective, because that's what I learned, was static images. Like
mm,
you're working on something for a magazine or some kind of print. Back when I learned
yeah,
it, it was for print before the internet. And even now with the internet, I think most designers with a graphic design background look at a web page as a static page, but you
yeah,
have actions happening, you can have animations happening. And so I think you definitely you cut the learning curve down, but that learning curve then is like, okay, here's this all new functionality and you have to figure out how it works. Luckily there's a lot of tutorials available. So
For sure.
yeah. I remember when I was learning the web programming languages, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and I dabbled in a little bit of C++. And back then, I always remember there were various rules to go by. And I remember one was, if you can avoid, and I'm talking about the 2000s, if you can avoid anything that's animated, and if you must animate something, don't make it a really fast, or well, a pulsating animation that automatically comes up on the screen, the same way that you shouldn't have sound start automatically.
Mm-hmm.
I remember these kinds of rules that I learned, that I was being told, because I didn't actually learn from one mentor. I'm pretty much self-taught, but I did know people who were already in the field as professionals, graphic designers, web designers, and I actually learned, bits and bobs from them and managed to get a good learning system. So I really do believe that if you've got these experiences and the background, I mean, I won't pretend to be a web programmer now, but I can still understand HTML, JavaScript. I can still communicate with the developers. But I think if you have all of these tools, yeah, it does half the learning curve, and you just have a naturally better learning system because you're just familiar with it. I mean, terminology is the same. A drop shadow is the same in any tool, right?
Right.
Palettes, gradients, they're all the same across the board, whether you use Paint, Paint Shop Pro, CorelDRAW, Dreamweaver, Fireworks. I think actually most of them have been bought up by Adobe as it happens, I think.
Which is why the terminology is the same. But
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I guess
Certainly
like
helps.
yeah, when you are learning something or teaching something to someone else that is maybe learning something for the first time, the easiest way to kind of get them up to speed is to kind of use an analogy, right? So,
yeah,
what is this
definitely.
thing? It's kind of like this, but in this way. I think even companies do this, like when they're trying to send their elevator pitch, like, oh, we're like Uber, but for this other industry, or we're like
Yeah,
Netflix, but for this industry.
yeah, definitely. Well, actually, I'm glad we're bringing this up because I wanted to ask you about the education, design in general, but more before we get onto the design, because obviously we want to talk about product design. Because for some of our listeners out there, or for some of us, there is a blurred line between product design, UX design. Is UX design part of product design? Maybe, but is product design always or some of the time UX design? Not always. So that's something we would really like your expertise on, especially for our listeners out there, again, who may not be entirely clear. But what would you say is, as an educator of UX, what would you say is an important thing in educating or teaching people, the new and upcoming generations, but
Mhm.
teaching them in a way where they can be as prepared for the real world, i.e., working for an actual company with an actual project, with actual team members, deadlines, etc., etc. How does one educate or teach people to be prepared for those kinds of realities, as opposed to doing a project that is theoretical, academic in nature?
That's a really good question. I think that there's a lot to unpack here because I think that we're living in an age right now where there's so much like, I mean, this wasn't the case 10, 15, 20 years ago, but there's so much knowledge on the internet right now that you could basically
Yeah.
teach yourself, JavaScript, you could teach yourself whatever, like all of this stuff that you could just learn from YouTube videos or whatever, and basically just sit in front of a video and then try to do it. Um, this is both a good thing and an extremely terrifying thing because there's so much knowledge out there that it can be knowledge that you try to do, and maybe because you're just doing it from a video, it wouldn't work. For
Yeah.
example, like boot camps are one method that people find useful. I teach at I've taught at other boot camps. Now I'm teaching at Memorizely, and it's good for some people, but would I recommend a boot camp for every single person out there? I don't know. I think that some people really thrive in that sort of environment where there's a structure and there's a road, there's a thing that you're trying to accomplish, while others, they might be better off just kind of making, concept projects and stuff like that, and then, applying to jobs that way without kind of the structure of a curriculum and that sort of thing. So in
Mm.
a way,
Yeah.
it's tough because there really isn't a one size fits all way for someone who is trying to learn UX or product design or whatever it is to get there. But at the same time, it's kind of like you have to kind of find your own method of, this is how I'm going to learn. This is how I'm going to structure it. Maybe you could use Notion or kind of like a productivity tool to make sure that you're trying to, learn as much as
Yeah.
you can every day. And I think one of the best things that someone can do is reaching out to people like on LinkedIn, like reaching out on LinkedIn to, someone that maybe could provide mentorship, or there's a lot of platforms, especially in the design community, ADP lists and some other ones where you can basically just like find people that have a little bit more experience and kind of, see if you jive with them. And if you don't, that's okay too. But at least it gives you a way to basically see if it's something that you would enjoy or something like that.
Yeah. And would you say in relation to that, that compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago when we were all getting into design, I mean, I was learning programming languages and graphics from the age of 12, 13, building computers from the age of 15, 16. Would you say that it can be more fun to learn? We obviously have different methods. We have YouTube, we have personal websites of people giving tutorials. But would you say that the learning methods can also be more fun? Because for me, the way I learned HTML, JavaScript, and CSS was through W3 schools. And I don't know if it's still free to do so, but back then it was a case of learning from that. And I used Notepad whenever I was coding. I always used Notepad just because it was where nothing would be misaligned. It was pure, as opposed to someone if you used Publisher or Word. But would you say that learning is more fun now because there are more methods, and as a result of that, easier to it's easier for people to learn, but at the same time, would you say that the caveat with that is more, because it's so much easier to learn, that more people can do it, and thereby it makes it harder to break into the industry?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because there's so much more competition, and it's basically like, all right, I did this certificate course with Google or something like that, but so did 1,000 other people. So that is a good
Yeah,
point. I think that like in terms of learning, like learning is such a weird thing because I feel as though the best way that someone can learn is doing so with no constraints. And it's basically like if you watch a kid learn how to do something, they're basically just having fun. And like because there's no sort of pressure to basically just like learn a new task, maybe like for example, like when I mentioned earlier, when I was younger, I wasn't in school or anything like that. I was basically just watching my older brother work on Photoshop. So I was kind of like, oh, I want to make some cool stuff. So I was, making
yeah,
baseball cards and things like that with Photoshop. And for me, it was just sort of like a fun thing that I could do with my friends. But at the same time, like that was setting the stage for now where I'm learning, new tools or I'm learning about new features that Figma comes out because I kind of want to
Yeah.
make sure that I'm ready for the workforce. But at the same time, it's sort of like I'm not doing it for. I mean, yeah, I find Figma fun, but there's a sense of it where it's kind of like I'm not doing it solely to have fun, which is a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand that feeling. When I've been designing the odd project, whether it's my own or I'm collaborating with anyone, I do feel that compared to when I was getting to grips with Photoshop, I found that if as a comparison, if I used Figma for 20 years and compare that with using Photoshop for 20 years, I would actually remember more from Photoshop just because I enjoyed it more.
Hmm.
I would
Yeah,
I would remember I would remember the stuff more because I wasn't thinking about learning. I was just picking it up like a sponge. I mean, that's why children learn best with languages and music because they don't think about, wrong notes, false relations. They just learn and they gradually just somehow filter that out. But speaking of
exactly.
education, actually, yeah. But speaking of education, again, as I was briefly mentioning earlier, there is, I think, for some of us, there is a blurred line between UX design and product design. And if you had someone, be it a UX student or a product design student, how would you define, not necessarily not necessarily in layman's terms, but how would you define the differences between UX and product design, the similarities along with the differences? How would you define that, John?
Another good question. I think that like you can talk to 10 different designers, and you'll probably get maybe 5 to 8, maybe 10 different responses for this. Because I do think that like it's sort of like a nuanced difference. I mean, I think on my LinkedIn it says like UX and product designer because I've had roles where I was called a UX designer and I've had roles where I was called a product designer. And I've had roles where my title was one and people would refer to me as the other. So I do think that there is one of the reasons being that like because it's a relatively newish field. It's not really. I mean, it's been around forever, but now people are actually naming it. Um, because it's relatively new, I feel like some people have certain opinions about what it should be called. The way I kind of see it is, just taking it very literally. A UX designer is basically the person that is concerned about the user's experience, whereas a product designer is concerned about the health of the product. So why this is kind of confusing though is that if you care about the health of the product, then you definitely want that product to have a good user experience. So you could kind of see where there's a little bit of it's a kind of a Venn diagram. I mean, I would say that UX and UI have a little bit more of a clear distinction because obviously the UI kind of implies a lot more visual versus UX, which is not necessarily just visual. But when it comes to the product, it maybe is a little bit more general where it's not only concerned about the user's journey, but also kind of like the growth of the product from a business perspective, or things along those lines. But again, I mean, like I think that like my response to that may be completely different from the next designer that you guys talk to, and there's a few of us here, like each of us may have a slightly different opinion of it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid point to bring up. I mean, even if there's a widely accepted general definition that I think a lot of people would agree with, I think those same people would still have a slightly different opinion, or they might approach it from a different point of view or creative dimension. I think, but I think that with your explanation, I think a lot of us out there will still have a clearer understanding. I mean, arguably, user experience is mainly, not only, but mainly to do with, as you said, the user experience, doing the research, using research principles and methods, finding out what people want in order to produce a viable product. And that is what it is. Unarguably, a website is a product. It offers a service in some form. It doesn't have to be commercial. It can be completely informational. But then there's also apps. Apps offer services, everything from managing your calendar to connecting with people on social media. But product design doesn't necessarily, well, I would say product design does incorporate what people need. I mean, I will not pretend to be a product designer, even if I may have a grasp of it. But I think that's a very good point. I don't think it can be universally defined, but I think there can probably be a basic acceptance that there are differences. As you said, a Venn diagram. They overlap, but they do have their own unique characteristics. And that brings me on to another question, John, is how would you, if you've got a student in UX design and they might be more inclined to do logos, graphics, maybe even user interface, how would you be able to recommend someone to pursue a particular field in design? So maybe they don't like the UX part, maybe they're not into research and interviewing people, but perhaps they really love the visual stuff. But as Zach said earlier, not necessarily in a prototyping way, user interface, but more as in the 2D aspect, designing a logo, designing a wallpaper. How would you gauge someone or encourage someone, to be more accurate, how would you encourage someone to pursue that design path that where you or and they feel their talents lie more, or even web design if they liked code, for example? How would you kind of guide them with that?
Yeah, I guess every designer out there, every student out there, whatever, has a particular interest, and just taking, let's just call it UX design. UX design, as you mentioned, it starts with research, and it like the whole first part of UX design has nothing to do with UI, nothing to do with visual. So there's this whole branch of people that are user researchers, let's say, and never touch any sort of visual creation tool, any sort of prototyping tool. And then there's people that are completely different, where they're more visual designers. They only kind of like enter the chat when there's basically something to do visually, whether it be starting with, lo-fis or hi-fis, or however late they get into it, they are not doing any of the research, any of the interviewing. They're only doing the visual stuff. That's perfectly fine. I think that seeing where someone's strengths are is very important, whether it be yourself or someone that you're working with or teaching or whatever it is, because you don't want to do something, or you don't want a career in something that you don't really like. So if you are someone that really loves the visual aspect of design, you know in my experience, the bigger that a company gets, the more specific job roles get. So, for example, if you're at a 3-person startup, you're probably going to do all of the design work. You're probably going to maybe even code. Who knows? Because there's kind of just like not a lot of not a lot of people here, so it's sort of like who's going to do all this work, and it probably is going to fall on the creative person, for the elements that are creative. But as a company gets bigger, and everyone has kind of like their sweet spot for how big or how small a company they'd like to work with. Some people like small companies, some people like mid-size or big or whatever it is. But as companies get bigger, usually what they could do is restructure their teams to kind of break them out to user researcher teams, or the specific UI team, which only handles like more visual stuff, or maybe there's graphic designers that only do they don't touch prototyping, but they only do stuff that's related to making logos, like you said, or something along those lines. So I think that it's definitely not easy at times, because sometimes we change our preferences for what we like to do, or we want to get into
Yeah,
something that maybe we hadn't been doing before. But once you kind of
definitely. Yeah.
can gauge that, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, I'm looking specifically for this role, which has no research at all, and it only has visual design, or vice versa.
Yeah, again, it's one of those things, right, where I think everyone can understand the basic gist of it, but again, there are some variables, absolutely. And I wanted to ask actually another topic. It's something we've not brought up too much here at the Frame by Frame podcast, but I know from your background that you obviously you've said that you did journalism and you've done creative writing. Have you done much in the way of UX writing? And if so, how did those creative writing and journalistic skills help? Because I found that when I'm writing about UX, whether it be writing guidelines for inclusivity, accessibility, or even just general textual presentation, I found that when I did creative writing classes in college, which isn't university in the UK, it's just pre-university, I found it really helped my writing significantly because I could do various styles. How would you say that that has helped or could help for those who may be thinking of doing creative writing? How could that help in the field of UX writing, John?
So I guess just to back up again, it's kind of interesting because I would say that UX design has so many transitional skills that can come from different fields. And when I was in school, I had no idea that I would be doing design. Like I said, like when I was learning like all those creative Adobe tools as a kid, I didn't really intend to go into a creative field, even though I was, doing writing and stuff like that. Um, and I come from a pretty writing heavy background. My both my parents were involved in either English teaching or technical writing and that sort of thing. So I think that it was just around me a lot. So I did like the writing part of it. But now, because I'm more of kind of like a UX generalist, I do a little bit of research, but I wouldn't call myself a researcher. I do a little bit of visual stuff, but I wouldn't call myself like a strictly like a UI or graphic designer. And the same thing with UX writing or content design. Like I've worked, I've worked to kind of understand how a brand wants to perceive itself, how a company wants to perceive itself, and whether they want to kind of use language to tell a customer that like, oh, we're the friendly company that wants to be your pal and help you that way, or if they're kind of more on the fintech route, let's say, and they want to tell you that your everything is secure, everything is fine. So I mean, like I think that doing creative writing in school and or journalism in school, it does teach you like a specific way of writing and a specific way of structuring a story, which is very, very different from, let's say, content writing or UX writing. But you're right, it does kind of give you the structure of like, um, you want to kind of know your audience and what your audience is looking for. In many cases, in when it comes to UX writing, is just something that's very straightforward. You don't want to use too many words. You want to kind of like display your actions as is and be extremely straightforward. So I think that like it does help, even though it's a skill that it seems very, very different.
Yeah, that's another good point you've brought up that's perfectly valid. Is it's always writing when it comes to UX writing, it's all about the audience. I mean, okay, it's the same in user research. I mean, if I'm going to develop an app that involves German, and obviously I'm going to be looking at people who speak German, not people who don't, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, when it comes to this kind of stuff, I think it is very important to know your audience because if I'm going to design a product for children and I want to get their opinion and I'm doing UX writing, of course I'm not going to be using any technical or slightly old-fashioned language, be it writing in English or German. I'm not going to be using words that they will never have heard. Whereas if I was designing a product or an app that is has a somewhat baroque feel to it, or maybe something Shakespearean, then of course I would use language and even design themes that tell people that this is what it is, because then they can relate better if that's what they want. And I
Mhm.
think, and personally, that is one of my that's an ethos of mine is to really make sure I give the people I'm intending to create a product for, or an app, or a website, or whatever, to give them the best user experience, which is what we do as UX designers. It's not about necessarily what we think. I mean, what we think can be a good starting point if you've got no ideas, but then you have to make sure. And I was guilty of this when I was doing Photoshop, actually. When I was starting to learn, I was making avatars for forums and wallpapers. And sometimes I would just use all of the bright colors because I liked it without really accepting that people didn't necessarily like it because it was hard on the eyes.
Hmm.
And that was often the problem I had in learning, especially when I was younger. Zach, Will, did you guys have anything for Jonathan? I know we talked about, I think you guys had a couple of things. Did you
Yeah, I have a
did you have any?
like a fun, short, little innocent little question here. John, what's the most recent tool you've decided to start learning and why?
Um, Actually, that's a good question. So I started learning this a long time ago, and I got a little bit okay with it. But um, Framer, I think that Framer is a really
Hmm.
cool tool, which is kind of like it's you could do a little bit more with it than Figma in terms of like development, but then you could do a little. It's a little bit easier than something like Webflow. I've been I used last year to mostly just kind of like work full time and whatnot, and I kind of stepped back a bit from freelancing. But now this year, I kind of like am making it a point to kind of like get back into freelancing a little bit more.
Nice.
Just to kind of like supplement and stuff like that. And I feel like that's a tool that if I am working on a project, it might be good to kind of like have that knowledge to basically, if clients need something done, I could kind of, use my skills of designing with Figma and, Miro and, all these other tools, but also use something like Framer if they want to kind of like put it online. So far it's going well. Definitely would not say I'm a master of anything when it comes to it, but it's always good to learn a new tool.
Absolutely. And you're always going to start at the I suck at this level anyway, so it's fine. I actually
Yeah.
wrote a post the other day about how I started something new. I have about 10 hours in, and it took me way too long to get something I wanted out of the tool, but eventually I got it. But it's funny you mentioned Framer. That's actually pretty high on my list, and I unofficially mentor some Career Foundry students, and we're meeting, or my next meeting with my friend, I guess, is about portfolio hosting sites, and I am very, very close to just telling him to use Framer. We're gonna look through a bunch of different options together, but at the price, like I think it's very, very hard to beat. Like if you're gonna choose a paid option,
Yeah.
I think it's
And
awesome.
and the speed as well. I mean, like I've been using Webflow for my personal portfolio for years now,
Hmm.
and it's just sort of like the kind of thing where I'm seeing that I could do similar things in Framer in like half the speed. I mean, obviously, it takes me a little bit of time to find where these buttons are and
Of
things like
course.
that because I haven't been using it as much. But it just seems like once I kind of get the hang of it a little bit more, it's going to just make that workflow a lot faster. So, but good to know. I mean, like I'll definitely connect with you and we could talk more about it.
Oh my
Yeah,
god.
that'd be fun.
Yeah, I got to contact you because I've been asking people about Framer. So I'm currently using Webflow as well, and yeah, I just keep seeing people write about it or comment about it, and I'm like, all right, this is something I have to check out, and I don't know. I feel like I'm wasting time if I switch to a new tool when I have a design in Figma at the moment for my Webflow. But yeah, I don't know. I need to find more people that have information on Framer for me.
I just realized actually I used Framer about 6 months ago initially to design my portfolio, and I've just re-downloaded it and opened it, and I'm thinking, actually, it's not that bad.
That's
But the
good to
only
know.
problem I had with the only problem I had somehow was, I think it was when I can't remember. I think it might have been Behance or maybe even Webflow. I'm not sure because I use Wix for my portfolio, my website. And I remember I couldn't get the exact design from Framer into whichever website I used. And because I remember I got into Framer because I saw a tutorial about how to design your portfolio within a couple of minutes through AI, of course. And I remember thinking, well, this will be good. You know, if I really have to, I can make it myself, do all that stuff, but just to save a bit of time, just to get it out there. But I found it actually a little difficult. So I would say that I've got a little bit of experience with Framer, but for me, I really have to get more acquainted with working out how to export that to a website. And maybe in Wix, I will use Framer to completely redesign it. But when I used it months ago, I actually thought it was pretty good. Everything was easy to use, and you could crop the images perfectly without losing the quality. I mean, the size. I think so. Actually, I quite like Framer. I don't know how much you can do with the free version because that's what I used, but I think it's certainly good to. The free version gives you enough to get acquainted with it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Yeah. And also, I mean, like it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where, you know, when you're learning a new tool, it kind of just puts your brain in a certain space where it's good for you. Like you're diversifying your tool set and you're getting good at something else, which you know, maybe you'll continue to use it or maybe you won't, but at the same time, like it gives you like a little bit of a diverse kind of like understanding of like what other people are using and maybe the pros and cons. You know, maybe they align with you, maybe they don't, but at the same time, like at least you're trying it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely.
I
Okay,
do have
I'm
a
actually in
follow up.
Framer now. My domain's taken for some reason. Who would take my name, Cross Preston?
It
Okay,
wasn't
Cross
me.
Preston UX. What? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was someone. I'll have to track them down and make inquiries, I suppose. But or maybe it was me and I forgot. I don't know. Maybe I had another account. Who knows? Yeah, sorry, Will. I know you wanted to go on say something.
Yeah, all good. Thanks. So, John, I know you mentioned, well, I mean, you explained that this kind of all started with like your own personal or passion projects when you were younger, playing with these tools just when you're home from school. Um, I can totally relate. Like a lot of my development and like whether it comes to skills and networking has come from personal projects and just stuff I want to do on the side, aside from my actual like boot camp education, which I did all throughout 2022, or aside from job seeking, or aside from my actual job responsibilities. And I'm really trying to figure out a way to tell my mentees, like, hey, do passion projects. You're gonna get way more development out of these. Than
I have a funny story about that. I guess I do remember when I was kind of like in that position of kind of like looking for earlier, you know, design roles and you know, because I feel like the I mean the job market's a bit tough right now for sure, but I feel as though the less experience you have, the harder it is because there's just so many candidates that you're competing with, and especially with, you know, there's so many boot camps out there that like everyone's portfolio might look a little bit similar because, you know, everyone has kind of like those three perfect projects that they did at their boot camp or you know, something along those lines. And I find it interesting because like I had done a passion project a while back, and this was kind of like in the middle of I had like real work projects. So this is, you know, I was already in the workforce. I was already designing, and I remember being on multiple interviews at like different times too. Like not even like the same week or whatever, but like multiple interviews like over the course of like a, you know, a couple of years even. And you know, how you kind of like want to put your most recent project first, or you kind of want to put your the project that like kind of makes the most sense for the role first. And I remember for a couple of them, the you know, maybe like the design director or the hire manager, whoever it was, kept going back to my passion project because it was kind of like a it just seemed so different. And I think it had I don't really remember what it was, but it was like, you know, really bright colors and funky stuff. Um, but it's just interesting because like I think that what you don't really get a lot of time when you're you know, when people are looking at your portfolio because they're probably looking at other candidates, and really there's kind of like a thin line between, you know, can this get the attention of someone but also in a positive
Yeah.
way, So, but I find it interesting because I had like these actual work projects from like actual companies, and multiple people were basically like, "Oh, tell me about this other one."
Hmm. Yeah. How would you say, speaking of portfolios, I mean, the subject of portfolios is something that we've talked about in previous episodes. We even had a whole episode dedicated to portfolios. How would you say someone gets the difference between making sure that a portfolio is obviously professional and clear, but at the same time, as a portfolio is personal property, so to speak, how does one get that balance between, yeah, having it professional, clear, um, des- having a design where it's for everyone, but at the same time adding their own personal touch because the portfolio is representative of you as a designer, as that's your biggest selling point. How does someone get that? For those listeners out there who may still be doing their portfolio or maybe thinking of revising their portfolio, how can they add a personal touch to distinguish their portfolios and themselves from others? As you said, sometimes it can be a bit linear, a bit uniform, cookie cutter. How does one get that balance in terms of having a strong portfolio that stands out, shows their own individual flair and their creativity, but at the same time isn't something that would make a potential recruiter find it too difficult to use, too hard on the eyes, or perhaps very convoluted? What would you say about that, John?
I guess like the best way to put it is that when you are making your, you know, personal, like you're basically creating your personal brand. Like you yourself are a brand, so you're trying to sell yourself as, you know, a brand experience, right? Um, so oh, oh, 1 second. Okay. So basically, like when you are creating this portfolio, it's like, you know, you want to have um, have enough of yourself in there. You want to kind of like tell people who you are, what your interests are, you know, a little bit about your experience, but also kind of have, when you're showcasing your work, you want to have enough of that work that kind of, you know, follows the UX process, and it follows, you know, like this is what I did for this project. I did the research, I did the visual design. So it's very much kind of like not an easy thing to do, because I think that if you put too much of your personality into it, then it may turn people off, because,
Yeah.
you know, it may be a little bit too much for someone, to see you know, your really bright colors or something like that, or something more serious than that. But yeah, I mean, like I think it's you want to avoid the cookie cutter, but at the same time, you kind of want to make it somewhat similar so that, the visitor to your website is not kind of like, this is completely different from what I was expecting.
Yeah, that is, I think, the key thing that our listeners can take away for those who are working on their portfolios, or perhaps they've got a mental block, right? Well, designer's block, as I call it, where they might have a million ideas of how they want to do it, but they can't choose a few, or they can't mesh them where they get really good design and an appealing portfolio. I mean, my portfolio, I would say, is actually very, very basic, to be honest, because I was never, well, when I was younger, if this had been 15, 20 years ago, I would have had loads of bright colors and just thrown in everything I could, especially if it was a special effect and it was fancy. I'd think, oh, I like it. So people must find fun in it. Of course, that's not always the case. But for me, my portfolio personally is one where it's easy on the eyes, it's basic, and there's no fear of using white space. I mean, mine has quite a lot of white space, I would say. But for me, it's part of my portfolio because it separates all of the elements that so they don't run into each other, even though they're all connected by the theme or the project. I mean, for you, John, when you design your portfolio, what was it that you had in mind? So again, adding that personal touch, but at the same time not making it too personal to the point where someone can't understand your design methods, processes, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, I would also say like I'm a big fan of white space. I think that like a portfolio specifically is trying to do really, I guess, two things. Like one is just basically showing what you've done, and two is kind of giving a little glimpse of who you are. And I guess three would be a way to contact you. So I mean, like if like that, I think that there's a lot of other experiences on the web that are a lot more complex than that. But your portfolio is basically just like it's the creative resume. If I look at a junior resume or something like that, I don't really get a lot of information. I basically just get a bunch of keywords. But if someone says that they know, let's say Figma, what does that mean? Like, does that mean that they've been using Figma for a week, or does it mean they are masters of Figma and have 10 years of, or I don't even know if Figma's uh, uh, around for 10, well, I guess it's, yeah. Yeah. I mean, like it's basically like how much of a skill that they know. So the portfolio is really a way of saying, okay, like this is what I've done with my tool set, and this is the work that I show. And I think white space, just having, you know, very clear, like this is what I've done, is enough for a portfolio. A portfolio could be a one pager. It doesn't have to be very complicated or complex. It's basically just a way of showcasing who you are and what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the key thing that sells who you are as a designer. I mean, I know we've talked about it a lot, and it's still obviously a current hot potato, so to speak, in terms of recruitment. I mean, AI, the gatekeeper, ATS. But would you say, John, because I think Zach had another question for you. I know Will does. But would you say that if you were a recruiter and you're presented with two pieces of information about a candidate, you've got their CV and you've got their portfolio, and I'm pretty sure now it would be a link. I don't think many people carry an actual heavy folder of their creations around anymore. But what would you say if you had to choose one? What would you say is the more important? I mean, if would you have a CV and a portfolio, or would you have, say, in the comfort of your own browser, if they've got LinkedIn, that person's LinkedIn profile in one tab and their portfolio in another? Would that be something where, as long as you see that they've got the skills, a little bit of experience, but as we know, experience, whilst there's no compensation for it, it's not everything. I don't think experience can be used solely to determine how much a designer can offer knowledge, skills, and everything. But what would you say to that, John?
I guess like I mean recruiters have a very hard a very difficult job in finding the right candidate, especially when they're sifting through hundreds of candidates at times. Like that's pretty difficult, because if you get it right, then it's all good. But I mean it's so easy to get it wrong because you're basing it off of, let's say, just looking at at what someone's done for like 20 seconds at a time. Um,
Yeah,
is a resume important? Yeah, it is. It definitely is. I think, especially like when you're applying to places, like I think if you apply without a resume, that's definitely, I would say, kind of like a red flag. But you're right. I think that like because of like ATS systems and it seems just like a little bit less relevant, to me at least. But I think applying with resumes, cover letters for sure, even and then having that portfolio and showcasing your work is kind of like the big triumvirate there. Or actually, throw in LinkedIn as well. I think that like the better way of basically making yourself stand out as a job candidate is just having a relationship with some sort of hiring manager or recruiter or something like that. Because if you're applying to a role on LinkedIn, let's say, you may already be at the back of the line because um, a lot of those jobs are were basically already open like months before, or maybe not months, but like weeks before they actually got posted. So
yeah,
you're already at a disadvantage. And I mean, like I would say like recruiters are probably hearing from people all the time. But establishing a relationship with them, even if you don't need a specific job at the moment, having a relationship so that they know your skill set and they could come to you if they have a job opening that like, oh, like I think that this job would be perfect for this candidate. And again, this is not easy. This is like a long-term solution, but I think that like just creating relationships online is the
Mm,
best
yeah.
way to get a job in the future for sure.
Yeah, I don't think it can be underestimated. The importance of networking, definitely. Will, Zach, did you guys have? I think Zach, you might have had a question or so just before we wrap up. Did you guys have anything to ask Jonathan or any subject to broach?
I tried to hit my space bar, but it wasn't working. No, actually, Jonathan's been very thorough. Like he's answered a lot of things that I would have asked anyway. I
I
was
try to
curious.
dot my I's and cross my T's.
You actually do a really good job. It's nice. Like your answers are very clear. I did want to ask about your, was that a renovation tracker? The whatever project you were the senior UX or still are.
Yeah, I'm still working at so basically I'm working with a like a property technology company, and they're basically the goal is to kind of digitizing renovation data. So like if you're renovating a house or something like that, like can you take that information and put it into data as opposed to kind of like asking the last person that worked on it, um, you know how many washing machines are in the full building unit. So definitely a complex project for sure.
That's
um,
actually really really interesting. Yeah, I
yeah
saw that and
it's
I was like,
yeah
all right, this, I have to ask
Yeah.
about this.
it's a cool problem to be solved, and I think that like the fact that it kind of hasn't like it kind of hasn't been by competitors and whatnot, makes it very interesting. But yeah, I mean it's definitely something that like it's still in its early stages, and kind of like getting it right is going to take some time.
But that's always okay, especially if it's a unique problem. Because I'm a big puzzle fan, so if I can find interesting puzzles that are difficult, yeah, that's I think that's what got me really into UX is some of the opportunities for some of these complex problems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think UX really is a puzzle because if you put one piece in one thing, is it kind of like messing up the other pieces that you already had in? So kind of like making sure that you're kind of like sharpening your axe before you're taking the swing at the tree, is a good way of doing it.
Yeah. Will, did you have any questions or anything for John, like I said before we wrap up? Or
Hmm. Yeah. So, John, what's your proudest moment in your design career, whether it's on a paid position or in your own personal stuff?
Proudest moment. I'm not sure. I guess like one thing is I mean, right now I'm in a very fun situation in my life. My wife is pregnant with our first child, and I think that it feels really fun. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of work to be done once the baby's born. But it just feels like it's obviously I take my work very seriously and whatnot, but I think that stuff like that is just it puts things into perspective, and it's like that's the important stuff to definitely focus on, for sure.
Awesome.
yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to round up this episode. I mean, you mentioned that your wife's pregnant, and we here just want to say congratulations.
Thank you.
Obviously, we hope everything, the baby grows up to be maybe the next Jacob Nielsen. Who knows if he or she goes into design?
it's
Yeah,
it's
but
definitely a possibility.
it's definitely a possibility. Yeah, it's already in the blood, John. Once someone in a family becomes a designer, then you set a creative legacy, for lack of a better way of putting it. But John, thank you so much again for coming on here. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners are going to take a lot from this, as they do from all of our guests, and indeed from us when we bring up specific topics. But thank you so much for coming on to our humble podcast once again. Thanks so much for the time and for the breadth of knowledge that you've provided. I mean, we've learnt things here, and we are just really appreciative of you taking your time out.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. So, for those of you out there who wish to connect with John, see his stuff, he's a top UX voice on LinkedIn. Just look up Jonathan Haines and he'll have the top UX voice badge. So, you'll know it's him. From all of us here, we just want to thank you all again for tuning in, for all of your support. We've got new listeners, we've got returning listeners, and we are now in the top 25 of all time design podcasts for Germany. So please help us get to the number one spot, because then we know that we are churning out really useful, good, informative information with clout, along with our special guests that always bolster that clout. All right. So from all of us here, from me, John, Zach, and Will, thank you very much. A good night, and we'll see you all on the next episode.